Thank you for being with us in our Bible studies tonight. We continue our study of the church, and this is the eighth lesson in this series of lessons. Before we enter into our lesson concerning the church, we'd like to remind everybody of the different resources available. We are meeting physically on Sunday mornings at 9:30 at the Oakwood Road Church of Christ. We record these services, and barring any problems, the services are available by 11 o'clock Sunday morning on the church website. We also meet Sunday night at 6 o'clock, and we have Wednesday night Bible classes at 7 o'clock for all ages. In addition to that, there are other churches who either record their services or live stream somehow so you can still worship virtually with them if you're unable to be out physically. We recommend the In Search of the Lord's Way program with Phil Sanders. It's on Sunday mornings at 7:30 on channel 47 on DirecTV, on Dish TV, channel 239, on Spectrum Cable on channel 3. And we also recommend the Gospel Broadcasting Network and World Video Bible School. These are two excellent virtual resources which have good Bible material where you can learn more about God, learn more about His will. And most of the material from both of these resources is either free or it's at a very minimal cost. In addition, of course, many other congregations, they either Facebook Live or somehow they make their services available. I would like to remind those of us who are physically able to be out and be other places and to work and be at entertainment venues and so forth, remind us of our responsibility to meet physically with other Christians. The command is there that we should encourage one another for love and good works, Hebrews 10:24, and then Hebrews 10:25, not forsaking the assembling ourselves together as the manner of some is. I understand there are some who cannot do this because of limitations physically, or maybe their health is compromised. But if we are able to be in other situations where we are around large crowds of people and have no problem being in these situations, and then fail to meet with other Christians, I think we need to take a little look inwardly at our heart and make sure that we are right with God. So again, I understand if there are certain health issues that people have that they feel their health might be compromised, and for that reason the fear is there. That is obviously between you and God. But to a person who can be out everywhere else among crowds and still not come out physically, I think we need to look inwardly to understand the importance of worshiping. We're going to be starting a few lessons on the topic of worship. It's important that we're able to be together to worship one another, and obviously to work, or not rather not to worship one another, but obviously to worship God and to be with one another. In addition to the resources, we are reminded, of course, of the fact that as we go back through our study of the church was in God's mind even before the creation of humanity. Ephesians, the third chapter, talks about the fact that even before God created us, the church was a part of His eternal purpose, which tells us it's something important. The kingdom prophecies of the Old Testament are fulfilled in the church in the New Testament. Just as God had prophesied in the Old Testament to establish this kingdom, and there are different qualities of this kingdom, among other qualities, both Jews and Gentiles will be a part of it, and that's fulfilled in the church. Also, Christ promised to build His church. So the church is definitely something important. We should try to follow Christ in our lives, and also we need to try to be His church. The church is not an earthly kingdom, and by that I mean that Christ never denied having a kingdom. He told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." But it's not a kingdom in an earthly kingdom in the sense that he takes armies and tries to force people to obey the gospel, or that we're just some type of a quote social force in the world. Obviously, if as Christians we're following Christ, and we are going to have social change in the world just because of who we are, but that's not our main focus, not being an earthly kingdom. Also, it's not a forerunner to an earthly kingdom. There's some difficult passages in the Bible that deal the book of Revelation, the doctrine, premillennialism, and yet even though these passages are difficult, there are clear passages which tell us that the kingdom is the church that's already been established. Some people look at the church as a parenthesis in history that God had intended to establish a kingdom, was unable to, and put the church in at the last minute. And this is not Bible teaching. The church and kingdom are synonymous, as Jesus uses those two phrases in Matthew 16, 18, and 19. But also, the church is not a denomination. Christ promised to build His church. And this is a message which I think sometimes is either misunderstood or maybe difficult to understand. But if Christ promised to build a church and we read about his church in the New Testament, why can't we simply be his church? Why can't we be Christians only? Why can't we just simply wear the name of Christ in religion and not have to follow after man? And that's our goal within the churches of Christ. We're obviously not perfect individuals. God's perfect, his word's perfect, and Christ is perfect. But we should strive to be the church that we read about in the New Testament. With that in mind, we're going to begin maybe 2 or 3 lessons on the topic of worship. And first of all, we're going to define what worship is. Our English word worship basically comes from the word worthy, that God is worthy of our praise or honor. A common word used in the New Testament, Greek word for worship, is proskuneo. It's a compound word which talks about, is obviously described as to worship, to prostrate oneself before, do reverence to. It has the concept of either bowing down in front of a person or even blowing a kiss to maybe even an idol god. The idea that you're showing respect or homage to this, whether it be the God of heaven or whether it be some idol, and you do this by physically doing something. In Matthew 2:2, this is the word that the Holy Spirit used to talk about the wise men as they had seen the star in the east and have come to worship Jesus. They wanted to bow down before him and show him respect and reverence. Christ told Satan in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 10 that you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. And this word is used, quite a bit in the New Testament. But a good definition of proskuneo is this: it's an inner attitude of adoration, but it's expressed in a physical manner. And if you think about it, in our worship services, this is what we do. We come together to worship God, and when we do, we have the right attitude inwardly as we worship him, but we do it physically. We do it through singing, through praying, through participating and listening to a sermon, by giving and taking of the Lord's Supper. Another word that's used less frequently is the word sebamai. And this verb, or this word, inherently has it within it a very sense of respect, more of a reverence attitude. To worship, have fear and reverence and respect. Going back to the Old Testament concept that even God is obviously to be feared and reverenced. We see these different qualities of God. We have a personal God who cares about us by sending Jesus to die for us, but also we should never lose that sense of fear and reverence for him. Matthew 15:9, Jesus uses this word talking about the Pharisees. In vain they worship me, teaching his doctrines, the commandments of men. And then in Acts 18:7, talking about Paul departing from there and entering the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. And so these are just two of the words, and there are other worship words used in Scripture, both in the Old and New Testament. But to summarize worship, basically you're talking about an inward attitude that is expressed properly to God. And we're not going to cover it in tonight's lesson, but we will in the next probably 2 lessons. But God could be worshiped only the way that he has set forth. That there are many sincere, good people that think they're worshiping God, and perhaps they're not doing it properly or doing it right. As Christ says, God's a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. In our lesson tonight, we're going to very simply look at Sunday, the first day of the week, as a day of worship, and consider that God had designated the Sabbath, Saturday, as a day of rest and worship for Israel. If you go to the Old Testament, you can find the various teachings there that on the Sabbath, the work was limited, travel was limited. But basically, it was to be a day when obviously God was worshiped, people would spend time with family. And he intended that as for the good of mankind, as Jesus says. The Sabbath was made so that we could, basically rest and maybe, develop a stronger relationship with God and with our own families. But there's a change that takes place. And following the resurrection of Christ, the church, we find, is established, and Sunday, the first day of the week, becomes a day of worship. And I think it's significant. Sunday becomes an important day in the history of the New Testament church. First of all, Christ was resurrected on Sunday, the first day of the week. Also, the church was established on Sunday. The Pentecost was uh, a Sunday, and that's what the day the church was established. And also, the church met on the first day of the week to worship. Pliny, who's a Roman historian, writes about the early church, coming together to worship God, about Christians. Now, he doesn't mention it as being the first day of the week, as far as the day that it happens. But he writes in a letter to the emperor about how on a fixed day, he says that they meet on a fixed day while it is yet dark and partake of a simple meal of a most ordinary and harmless kind, and they sing a hymn to Christ as God, and bind themselves with an oath not to commit fornication or theft or any violent crime, etc. And of course, again, he doesn't mention this as Sunday, but the early church history shows that this was the day that the early Christians met on. In Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, Sunday, the first day of the week, we find Luke telling us that on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. And basically, the phrase to break bread is a technical phrase for the Lord's Supper. So the disciples came together on Sunday, the first day of the week, to worship God, to break bread. Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. What we learn from this example is very simply that Paul, on that first day of the week, preached to these Christians when they came together to eat the Lord's Supper. We also read in 1 Corinthians 16:1, Paul's talking about taking up a collection for the saints. Then he says in verse 2, on the first day of the week, let each one of you, it says lay something aside. The grammar suggests that you already have laid it aside. Lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come, that Paul was going to come there at some point and collect this money. But it tells us, among other things, these Christians met on Sunday, the first day of the week. The Apostle John writes in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7, he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Well, what day would belong to the Lord? Obviously, it would be Sunday. But even though the New Testament example is there that Sunday is the day that Christians are to worship on, there's an increasing movement in Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, to make Sabbath as the day of worship and Sunday not being the first day of the week. So the question we're going to look at in the remaining part of our lesson tonight is, should we observe the Sabbath today? You know, some people say, well, God ordained the Sabbath during the creation week and had intended for all mankind to observe it for all time. A second point they make is that the early church observed the Sabbath, but the Catholic Church changed the day of worship to Sunday. And I hear this frequently, and we'll get to this a little bit later on in our lesson. But first of all, we need to correctly understand the difference between the different covenants that God makes. The word covenant means an agreement between God and humanity. God made a covenant with the Jews, what we call the Old Testament. But God made it clear that that covenant was to be a temporary covenant. It was not to last forever. And God was going to establish a new covenant, not only with the Jews, but with the Gentiles also. Christ himself said, for surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. And following the resurrection of Christ from the dead, he writes in Luke, or speaks in Luke 24, saying that all things written in the prophets must be fulfilled concerning him, and they were, concerning his death, of course, his burial and resurrection from the dead. Paul, talking about the Old Testament law in Colossians 2, says, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross, so let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath. These individuals were trying to mix Judaism with Christianity. And some people think of the Christianity as sort of a patched up version of Judaism, and it's not. It's a completely new religion. Now, there's no doubt we learned certain principles from the Old Testament, from Judaism. We learned how God is to be worshipped. We learned other important principles. But Christianity is not just a patched up version of Judaism. It's a completely new covenant and a completely new law. Paul, or the writer of Hebrews, says in Hebrews 8:7, if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. The Sabbath was a part of that first covenant. It's not a part of the second covenant. And then he says, a new covenant, he has made the first old, now that which is decaying and waxing old is ready to vanish away. The fact that even though the old law had been done away with at the cross, it basically was fading out, especially as the Jews approached the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, when basically the temple was destroyed and Jewish worship there ceased for a long period of time. So, with that in mind, getting back to this question, should we observe the Sabbath today? We'll look at these 2 points. First of all, some people say God ordained the Sabbath during the creation week and intended for all mankind to observe it for all time. And second, the early church observed the Sabbath, but the Catholic Church changed the day of worship to Sunday. Let's look a little closer at this fact that some people say God ordained the Sabbath during the creation week. In Exodus 31, verse 12 through 18, says the Sabbath is described as a sign between God and Israel forever, and we're going to talk about that phrase forever. The first Bible mention of the Sabbath being observed is in Exodus, I believe it's chapter 16 or 17, as the Israelites are leaving Egypt and they're in the wilderness on the way to Mount Sinai. That's the first explicit reference to anyone observing the Sabbath. Even as Moses writes in Genesis, chapters 1 and 2 about the Sabbath, God resting on the Sabbath day and God establishing that, Moses writes that when the Exodus is occurring, or he's writing that in the time frame of the Exodus, even though the fact that God had established the seventh day as a day of rest. I think it's significant in Deuteronomy, the fifth chapter. This is toward the end of the 40-year wandering. And this statement is made concerning the Sabbath. If you read those three verses, it says, before God restates the Ten Commandments, all before following about 40 years of wandering, he states that the covenant, these Ten Commandments, was not made with our fathers, but with us, those who are here today. So, the people who say the Ten Commandments were in vogue or in practice before uh, uh, God gave the Ten Commandments there on Mount Sinai, to say that the Sabbath was given at creation, sort of disagrees with what Moses says here. He says God didn't give these Ten Commandments to the patriarchal world. Rather, he gave them to the nation of Israel. He gave them initially then there in Exodus chapter 20 on Mount Sinai. So the argument that somehow God established the Sabbath at creation and that the patriarchs all observed the Sabbath, Israel observed the Sabbath, and we are today, is simply not a biblical argument. The problem here is we mentioned here that it says the Sabbath is mentioned as a covenant that is to be forever or perpetual. This sometimes causes difficulty in understanding the Old Testament. And one of the reasons is the word translated forever in the Old Testament has literally means a period of time or age lasting. And that's sort of hard for us to grasp. But what it involves the concept of is that as long as this covenant is in force, this statute is to be in practice. In other words, as long as the Old Testament law was in force, this covenant was to be observed concerning the Sabbath. And there's other illustrations of this in the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 40 and verse 15, God tells us that he's establishing an everlasting priesthood. And he's talking here about the descendants of Moses and Aaron. And yet in the New Testament, we know that we no longer have an earthly high priest. We no longer worship in a temple in Jerusalem. We no longer look for the descendants of Moses and Aaron to be the priest. In fact, that all Christians are priests. And so this priesthood was done away with when the new covenant came. So it doesn't mean forever in the sense of eternally, the way we think of it, but it means age lasting. Leviticus chapter 16, verse 34, God is establishing the day, talking about the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament. And he says this is an everlasting statute. Well, again, it was in effect until the death of Christ. It's not everlasting in the sense that we think of eternal forever, because we don't observe the Day of Atonement today. We don't have a day of fasting and go to Jerusalem and offer animal sacrifices, but it was in practice under the Old Testament law. In Leviticus chapter 24 and in verse 8, the fact that the covenant there is mentioned as an everlasting covenant, talking here actually about the putting of the showbread on the table every Sabbath day, that the bread was to be traded out. And we find that that was to be everlasting. Well, we don't do that today, but under the Old Testament law, they did, under that covenant. And finally, again, in Numbers 25, verse 13, Moses again writes about this everlasting priesthood, talking about the descendants of Moses and Aaron and those being priests. So the fact that the word forever is used in reference to the Sabbath doesn't mean that it's in practice still in New Testament times. So with that in mind, we are reminded of the fact that the Sabbath was given only to Israel. It was not given until the Exodus, number one. Number two, the Sabbath was eternal, which means it was age lasting and no longer was in force after the cross. Third, there's no distinction made in Scripture between God's moral law and his ceremonial law. Frequently, arguments are made that whenever God's law is mentioned, that's still in effect, that the Ten Commandments are still binding today. But the ceremonial laws, sacrifices and things have been done away with. But actually, as we look at the Old Testament, we find that the word Moses' law and God's law are used interchangeably, and there's no distinction between a moral and ceremonial law in the Old Testament. But finally, as we understand, the law which Christians are under today is the New Testament, and that is our pattern. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the arguments made is that the Catholic Church established Sunday as a day of worship later on, and there's little doubt that the church councils established Sunday officially, quote, as a day of worship, I believe, in the 4th century. But this doesn't mean that they're the ones that technically established it. God ordained the first day of the week as a day of worship after Christ died. As we've already mentioned, the Christ was resurrected on Sunday. The church began on Sunday. Acts chapter 20, they came together to worship on Sunday. And obviously, the Lord's Day that uh, John is talking about, it would be the first day of the week. And in 1 Corinthians 16, too, we knew they gathered together on Sunday because that was the day they were taking up the collections. And so let's remember that. It is important that we do things the way God says, that it is our responsibility and our privilege to come together on the first day of the week as Christians to worship God. And in our next few lessons, we'll look a little closer at worship and what all is involved in worship concerning the church. We thank you for being with us in our Bible study tonight.